Welcome to Turmeric and Tequila with your host, Kristen Olson. Questioning a better way, one gracefully disruptive conversation at a time.
Welcome to Turmeric and Tequila. I'm very excited to be with you here today. We have a graceful disruptor in the house in mental health and wellness and all things human behavior. Before we jump into this amazing combo, I want to give some love to our sponsors, Lux Neuro, offering neurofeedback and counseling where your heart and mind align. For more information about what neurofeedback can do for you, listen to the neurofeedback stories of transformation in the middle of this podcast. Neurofeedback effectively treats everything from insomnia, anxiety, depression, trauma, ADHD, and much more. Optimize your brain today. Special thank you to Declan James Watches. They are local, beautifully handmade watches by a veteran, and 10% of all sales go back to the Navy SEAL Foundation. So check them out. And last but not least, our very own Colorado Clownfish Swim School, swim lessons and water safety training for all ages. We believe in life skills through sports. So come waterproof your family today. Get it done. Go swim. Without further ado, the Dr. Abbie, welcome to Turmeric and Tequila.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, I do want to read your bio because you're a rock star and you're checking a lot of boxes and you've got a lot going on. Of course, on Turmeric and Tequila, we find very eclectic, well-rounded humans. So I want to share the intel here. Dr. Abbie is a distinguished scientist and expert in human behavior, recognized by the U.S. Department of State as the top 1% specialist. She has provided behavior analysis training to elite units like the Internet Crimes Against Children, ICAC Task Force, including agents from the FBI, Secret Service, and DHS. With a Ph.D. in psychology, Dr. Abbie became a professor at 23 and is now the director of education at Social Engineer LLC. She continues to, she's been featured in Forbes, Apple News, and has been featured on BBC News and Wired. She's got a book we're going to talk about. But Dr. Abbie, on TNT, we get into all the details. But before we get into the mission, I want to hear about like the human behind the mission. So tell us about young Dr. Abbie. Like, how were you as a kid?
Oh gosh. So very different. I was kicked out of college, which is from 15 to 16. So I think that's high school for Americans.
Yeah.
So I was a little bit disruptive. I was kicked out of college, kicked out of my mom's house, kicked out of my dad's house. So living, neither of them knew. So I was practically homeless, living with friends, addicted to Class A, Class B drugs. So not in the best state of mind. And this was when I was 16 years old. And then I found psychology. So I was, like I said, very disruptive youth. And I had a point of recognition. I was away with an old friend and I was getting extremely bad withdrawals from drugs. And at that point, I had been kicked out of my dad's for throwing a party, my mom's for throwing a party. Clearly, I hadn't learnt my lesson. And I saw myself in the mirror and I saw someone that I didn't recognize. And I just realized how dangerous the situation was that I was in. And I had that realization of either I'm going to die from an overdose at 16 or something has to drastically change. So I managed to get myself back into college. I ended up getting 100% on all my psychology exams. I removed all of the friends that I had. And my psychology teacher at the time was the only person that believed in me. And she helped me find that I was good at psychology. And that's how it became my lifeline. I realized that this is something I'm good at. It's something that could help me understand me. And then once my grades started going up and I realized, okay, I love this. That's when I realized psychology and education could be my lifeline. So from that point, everything changed. And my whole life has just been about studying and psychology since. My dad let me move back in. So I got back into the house with my dad. I completely cleaned up my act, didn't touch drugs again, stopped drinking, completely isolated myself from bad behaviors and bad people, and everything changed from there.
That's incredible. I like that one light bulb moment, and I can tell you've worked with federal agents because you call it Class A and B drugs. So very well played there. But there's a lot to unpack because I think we've tried and reach all the audiences on TNT, but I really do focus on our up and coming and our young humans because I think they've got a crazy world to navigate more than probably our generation.
Yes.
And finding that pivot point or having that awakening is massive. But can I ask why, as a kiddo, why were you disruptive? Like, why were you acting out? Because I think so much of our points of mental health are just being misunderstood. Was that a piece of the why you were being disruptive?
You know what I love about the question you've just asked is, as a child, when I was acting out, that was the question that I was desperate for someone to ask me. Because a healthy, well-adjusted teenager doesn't become addicted. Because there's a difference between doing drugs and drinking and being an addict. And the psychology is very, very different. And kids can do drugs all the time and not feel dependent on them. For me to get to that point where it was really sink or swim, something had to be going on underneath. I was also engaging in self-harm behaviors. I was extremely depressed. I was suicidal. I had already committed one suicide attempt by 16. And my parents were very neglectful. So when I was desperately screaming out for someone to say, instead of punishment of, stop doing this, I was desperate for someone to say, why are you doing this? Nobody did. So I had grown up with a very neglectful mother. She is a antisocial personality. So she is what used to be called a sociopath. She doesn't process empathy in the same way. She was very verbally, psychologically abusive. And her and my dad would kind of take it in turns to leave and then stay. And she ended up running off with the window cleaner. So very sitcom style. So I had very bad attachment issues. And the way that I coped with that as a kid, and it took me many years to understand that this was a coping mechanism, is I would carry cuddly toys. And that's cute when you're very young, but when you're 10, 12, and you have multiple cuddly toys in your backpack at school, it's not so cute. So I was very badly bullied in school. And it just really spiraled. I was suffering with self-image. I was being bullied for my appearance. Some of the kids would call me fat. Some of the kids would call me anorexic. They'd call me ugly. They would pick on me for every side of the spectrum. So I never really knew what I was or who I was or where I was on any spectrum. So I just had no sense of self. So I was so completely lost. And then a couple of girls who used to bully me, they invited me to their group. And in order to be friends with them, it was, they did drugs. And I joined that group and they became really close, good friends. So that was my step into that world. And then I realized that the drugs took the pain away. And that's how I really got hooked into that.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important that our listeners get to hear, and the worldwide, the juxtaposition of where you can start one place and then enter in another. And I think all of those things are even more accessible to our young people, drugs from Snapchat or what have you. And there's a lot of parents that are disconnected. So that opportunity for like really deep trauma early on is really more prevalent than ever. So it's really important that and amazing that you can take, such a darkness and then turn it into something so incredible. Do you feel like with such a dark experience, it's provided such exponential empathy for you to relate on such an authentic level for some of your patients or students or anyone you're guiding or coaching?
Yes, absolutely. So one thing you do see with young children, and really the driver for maladaptive coping, is an inability to regulate. So that's the core of those negative behaviors, because they're feeling these overwhelming emotions and they don't know what to do with them. And they don't know how to move away. And you can't just will them away. So we turn to things like drugs and alcohol and bad relationships to either escape them or suppress them. Because when it comes to emotion, there's three things you can do. You can escape, you can suppress, or you can heal it. And heal it means feel it. But feeling it means the ability to regulate. And it's our parents that teach us that. And if we don't have that education, we don't know what to do with it. So I never really understood what I was feeling and how I was feeling and what to do with it. So that was the driver for me. So as I went through my life, I kept making these mistakes, and I got myself into some pretty dangerous situations again later on, and experienced another pretty horrific trauma later in my life. And I went down so many dark rabbit holes. And once I pulled myself through it, the only way that I did was through science. So I turned to the self-help books and blogs and TED Talks, and I found them very inspiring. But the problem is they're not based on human behavior. They're not actually based on how the brain works and how human behavior works. They give these great notions of what empowerment means. And you're like, wow, I can't wait to be bulletproof. And that's not how human beings work. So I ended up in a worse space because I was getting bad information. So I was following those teachings, and then I'd get deflated because I'm not healing and everything feels worse. So I turned to the academic literature, and I looked at myself like a data point of, okay, well, I don't understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing it or how I'm feeling. So I got myself from the darkest point I'd ever been in to the happiest point I'd ever been in through educating myself on how emotions work. And that's why I wrote the book that I did, because I wanted a book that wasn't a guide that's like, in this situation, do A, B, C, D. What I wanted to do was, especially for young people, is give them a tool on how to regulate emotion, something you can take to every situation. And if you can master your emotions, you really have almost full self-mastery, because that's the driving force of, as I said, going to maladaptive coping.
I love it. And the really practical steps, I think, are really amazing right now, because there's millions of self-help books. And you got to remember, this is a business. So these are monetizable angles in life and health and wellness. That's my background. So I could tell you a million stories on supplements and things. And there's quite the reason the podcast is here is to start bringing good people doing good things, because there's a lot of shade in the game. I do, before we get to the book and what you're doing right now, because that's super fascinating, I'm always curious on this pivot point. Like, if you're someone out there, and I do focus on my young people, but anyone that's listening and they're feeling stuck, what was it for you, especially as a young person? Like, I know you said you looked in the mirror and you felt something, but was there something intrinsically or outside of you or spiritually that came through that's like, this allowed me to step in the right direction? Because I think that pivot space is the key. Like, the first step in the right direction is the key, but that's the hardest one to take.
It is. And it's a really hard thing to translate that feeling, because the feeling for me was when I looked in the mirror and I didn't recognize myself. And it was shame. And this is why I wrote the book called Work in Progress. And the title was The Road to Empowerment, The Journey Through Shame. Because everybody says that shame is the antithesis of empowerment, and it's so not. You cannot be empowered without shame. It is actually the same thing. You have to go through shame. And I felt, when I looked at myself in the mirror, I felt such deep shame for who I was becoming and who I was. And I didn't want to feel that anymore. And it was that shame that said to me, I can't do this anymore. And that's the pivotal point, because shame comes in two ways. We either have toxic shame or healthy shame. This is why it's so important to educate people on emotions, because shame is a signal. It's saying to you something needs to change. That's all it's saying. Every emotion we feel is a signal from the brain about our environment. Shame is felt because it says the way you are behaving is not in line with who you are, who you want to be, or how you perceive yourself. So when we feel it, we can do two things. We can direct it to self or behavior. We can say, I feel shame, so I am bad and I am a failure. Or I feel shame, so my behavior is bad and my behavior is failing me. And at that point, when I looked in the mirror and I felt that deep shame, for the first time, I redirected to behavior, because I was feeling such disgust for myself. And I decided I don't want to feel like a failure, but my behavior is failing me. So something has to change. And if I hadn't had that point and I hadn't started reading about emotions, I don't think I would have had that changing point. Because when you feel that deep sense of shame, it's so easy to keep directing it to self. Because what happens is when we feel that the self is bad and the self is a failure, the psychological process that happens is go, well, because I'm bad, I'm not worthy, I'm worthless. And then we go, I'm unlovable. And if the self is inherently bad, what's the point in even trying to change? Because I'm bad at my core. And I've always been an ambitious person. When I was very young, I was always really studious. Before I got into the drugs and started behaving badly, I was always really driven and curious about everything. I was always a little scientist. There was always something in me that, the annoying kid that always asked, why? But why? Oh, but why? To everything. So there was something in me that wanted more for myself too. So I had what my dad has always said, there's been like a fire in my belly that's always pushed me through everything. And I felt that. And when I decided I don't want to feel shame for this person anymore, I knew that something had to change. And that's why I didn't take little steps. I said, if I'm going to be a different person, everything has to change.
Yeah, that's remarkable. And I thank you for unpacking the intel around shame, because I think it's like it's the emotion that gets like the worst PR
Yeah,
rap. Because
it
to me,
does.
shame is actually intel that you care. What scares me is when people are indifferent and they just don't care. It's like, well, and you don't feel anything. Shame to me is like you're against, like you said, like your core values. Like there's a
Yeah.
mismatch internally, and you feel it, and then you can make a step. So shame to me is extraordinarily powerful, and
Yeah.
we don't talk about it much in at least American culture. It's kind of something that's very suppressed down, but it is that fire inside of like, this isn't who I want to be, regardless of parents or society or anyone telling you how to be. Internally, you are off match.
Yeah, it's very taboo to talk about.
Yeah.
And actually, since publishing my book, I've had a lot of therapists reach out to me and say, what's crazy is they tell their clients that they need to get rid of shame. And they said that they've been taught in their training that shame is bad and shame is an emotion to try and get rid of. Because if the person is feeling shame, they're feeling worthless. And I said, but it's not, because if we think about how the brain works, the brain takes up 20% of our energy, yet it weighs 2% of our body mass. So it's extremely energy hungry. So it doesn't tend to do things by accident. Emotions aren't accidental. They're important information about our signals. Now, they can lie to us, but that's because they're driven for survival. They're not driven for the modern day. They're driven for survival. It wants to keep us safe. So when we feel that shame, just like if we feel anger, anger is that sense of, well, I've been wronged. There's an injustice. Shame is a sense of, I am doing something that is contradicting who I am or who I want to be. So I have to listen to it. The problem is that when we are told shame is bad, when we feel it, instead of taking that emotion, sitting with it and asking it, what are you telling me? We try and say, how do I make it go away? And that making it go away, when I say there's those three paths, the escape, suppression, and healing. If we're told shame is bad, we're going to go for one of the first two. We're not going to go for the healing it, because we're not going to try and question it and look behind it and sit with it, because it feels so, it's a horrible emotion to feel. Even healthy shame doesn't feel good.
Right.
But we know from the academic literature that if a person behaves in a way that isolates them from the social group or goes against social norms, and they don't feel shame, well, they're less likely to change their behavior and be accepted back into the social group. If they feel shame, they're more likely to behave pro-socially and try and make amends. So it is driven to keep maintaining our social relationships. So it's a really important thing that we learn to listen to it.
Amen. Can you lean into, once they feel that and like the healing space, do you suggest people have coaches, or is it just a guide like the book, or is it something we can self-regulate on our own? Like, how do you approach as an athlete? I'm always thinking like, get a
Yeah.
coach, get a consultant, do these things. Because a lot of this process, in my opinion, it's hard to do by yourself. But tell me, like, if you're in it and you're looking for a step forward, do you do this on your own?
So it really depends on the person. I'm a big advocate for therapy. But I also recognize that therapy isn't for everyone, because a lot of people, once they engage in therapy, they will identify with a victim mentality. And it's very difficult for those people not to do so. And even when they recognize that they're doing so, it's hard for them not to. And some people, they can't afford help, they can't afford a coach, but everybody should have access. The best way to start is simply education. And there's a lot of really great educational resources. And that's why like I said, I wanted to teach regulation rather than step-by-step guide. And I would say that that's the first step, because you can't remedy an emotion if you don't understand it. So anger can feel a lot like fear. Fear can feel a lot like grief. And emotions can very much overlap. And if you don't know how it presents in the body, and if you don't have a general understanding of emotions, for example, emotions feel enduring. When you feel an emotion, it feels like it will last forever. But that's just how it feels. Once you get that understanding of, well, emotions come in waves, it's really natural for that high and low, and then to feel a little bit numb sometimes. And it's also very natural and normal and healthy to sometimes feel a bit empty. That's part of the human experience.
Mhm.
But if we don't have this general education about how emotions work, when we feel them, we think there's something wrong with us. And then we start to think, well, there's something inherently wrong with me. We start to self-blame. So I would say that really is the first step. Seek out education on emotional regulation. And then when you do seek out that kind of education, it can help you heal in a way that you wouldn't otherwise have sought out. For example, what helped me heal is when I dived into the mindfulness literature. We all kind of inherently know that eating healthy and working out and going for walks are good for you, and sleep schedule, but we don't fully grasp it. When I dived into the literature of healing, what I found out is, well, when we have a good sleep cycle and we wake up as the sun comes up and go to sleep as the sun goes down, what happens is our cortisol levels and our hormones are regulated. So if we have a bad sleep schedule, not only are we exhausted and tired throughout the day, but our hormones are dysregulated. So we have fluctuating serotonin levels and dopamine levels and cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So that will push us in a direction of feeling negative. So if I want to cope, that's a really good way to start healing of, okay, well, let me regulate my sleep. And then things like going out in nature. Well, being in nature naturally boosts serotonin. So I was like, okay, well, I'll do these things, because how do I heal myself biologically? And then things like eating certain foods and having a good diet regulates your microbiome, which most of your serotonin is produced in the gut. And then things like, okay, well, how about how I talk to myself? So if I look in the mirror and I say, I'm a failure, I'm not good enough, I increase my cortisol levels. If I say, you can do this, you've got this, those positive affirmations, what actually happens is we increase serotonin, and we start to activate natural dopamine pathways when we do this continually. So we stop seeking out as much dopamine by sources like social media and those little things. And then, okay, well, what about if I get some exercise? Well, when we exercise, not only do we increase endorphins, but our muscles, as they contract, again, they help secrete feel-good hormones in our muscles. So all of those things, although we inherently know, do them, they're good for you. When you get the actual education of, well, this is why they're good for you, it starts to really drill in that point of, okay, well, maybe if I make these little consistent changes, and then I'm also aware of, okay, well, when I sit with this emotion and it feels horrible, but I'm aware that it should feel horrible, and I have to kind of listen and go with the flow and let the wave pass me by instead of reacting on that wave. When I compile all of those things, those simple changes over time lead to really drastic improvement. But again, it's that education of not only to do them, but why we should do them. Because there's a difference between someone saying, drink water, go outside, get fresh air, and then explaining to you how this can help your well-being. And that's why I always say, yeah, but why? Why? What's underneath it? Because that simple underlayer of education can really, really help.
I think the curiosity, thank you for sharing all that, because one, you hit on the whole human approach, which we talk a lot about on Turmeric and Tequila, because you need all the things to make this work and this be at peace and you're heartful. It really takes a lot of things. And some of it, I'm so with you. I think the curiosity is really the key of just start asking questions, challenge authority, challenge status quo, challenge some of these things so it fits for you. And with even with nutrition, like if you're getting rid of an emotion, and to me it's like getting rid of a macronutrient, like if you're just going all protein and carbs and you're getting rid of fat, you need that. So there's no getting rid of anything. They're all there for a reason. And it's intel. I think, as you so beautifully displayed, it's about that curiosity of asking questions and then understanding the base of it and the why. So it really resonates, but how it all works. And I really like your examples because it doesn't need to be these grandiose, huge changes. It's smaller stuff. Go to bed earlier, eat healthier. And if you want to get into the minutia of microbiome and all the things, by all means, but
absolutely.
take the Cliff Notes in parts, because there's a lot to know. I mean, you really need a doctor or professional for each angle if you really want to dive in, which is great because there's intel everywhere. I mean, our world is so instantaneous with our phones and, the internet and podcasts, and like information's out there. And I think you can just know enough to know how to treat yourself kindly and address the whole situation versus one part of it. And not the irony too, I think, is in this, like, where you can almost like shame emotions or shame your nutrition or shame certain pieces of your choice of your lifestyle that you really don't need to. Can you give us a good example of like maybe your biggest success story or someone you saw make such a turnaround through some of this whole human awareness?
Yeah, I mean, so I know personally, I went from a 2-year period where I was at that dark point where I was really ready to commit suicide. It was after I was dealing with sexual assault. I was dealing with my dad had a stroke. I was just done. I was really done, and I couldn't wake up and make myself feel happy. And I remember sitting on the floor of my friend's apartment and just saying, I don't know how to find joy. And I just want this to stop feeling so awful. And I called up my dad and I had said to him, I'm quitting my Ph.D. And for me, that was my way of saying, I'm done, goodbye. And I didn't want to tell them that's what I said because I knew they're trying to save me. And I didn't want that. And I'd said to him, I'm done, I can't do it anymore. And it was what my dad had said to me that made me realize that we have a choice. Because he said to me, no, you won't. You won't give up because you just won't. You'll get up because it's who you are. It's what you do and it's who you are. And I have it's who you are tattooed across my rib cage because that small thing, although it doesn't sound big, it was the tipping point for me because I realized, you're right, it is who I am. And actually, it's who we all are, but it's a choice because we get to choose who we are and who we want to be. And it was that point where I realized I have a choice to make. Giving up is a choice. Fighting is a choice. Who I am is a choice. And that was when I said, I'm going to make the choice to be someone better because it's who I am. I'm someone that grows. I'm someone who pulls myself out of the dirt and gets up. So that was when I said, okay, I feel awful right now, so it can't get any worse. So I have this education about what can help. So why don't I just put everything into doing these things? And it was that point, I would wake up at 6 a.m. every morning and I would feel awful. I would just feel Like I wanted to lay in bed and just let it all go. But in my head, I was saying, well, the education says if I get up and do this, it will help. If I do this, it will help. So I did all those things. And for a long time, it didn't help. I would still, I didn't do it for 2 days. And then I'm like, I'm cured.
Yeah.
I would cry on the bus every day to the gym, but I would still work out. And then I'd cry on the bus on the way to my office, but I would still work. And I would keep doing these things. I wouldn't push myself past my limit, but I would say, I have to keep doing these things that I know will bring me small amounts of serotonin. Because at that point, I wasn't thinking it's going to bring me happiness. It's just going to make me less sad. And then over time, I kept doing them. And then what happens when we do this is when we behave in a positive way, not only do we get those feel-good hormones, but we start to do things that we're proud of. So we start to undo things that bring us negativity. So one thing people struggle with a lot of the time is body image. So when you are working out and being healthier, you naturally just feel better about yourself. And when you're forcing yourself to get up, you naturally feel more productive. So you feel a sense of achievement. So all of these things started compiling. And in 2 years, I look back and I realized I'm more happy than I ever believed that I could be. And it was those small, consistent changes every single day. But I had to physically remind myself of them.
Yeah.
They don't just happen. You have to, when you feel like I want to give up and when I'm done with this and I just don't want to do this anymore, you have to remind yourself of why it's important. And that's what I found. And my dad would call me up every day. He's like, it just feels like this. It won't last forever. And I said, I know. And I'd repeat it to myself. It just feels like this, but it won't last forever. It just feels that way. And those reminders kept me pushing. And then, like I said, day by day, and I can't pinpoint that point where it started to feel like I love my life.
Yeah.
It was just almost like one day I turned around and I realized that I couldn't imagine being as sad as I was again. And I actually, I used to write poetry, and I found them recently, and I couldn't connect with them in the same way because I could feel the pain in them, but I couldn't psychologically put myself back in that place because I was so far gone from that pain.
Yeah.
And it was such a great reminder of why those little steps, the little things you do, are so important. And for anyone starting out, I would say the best way to start is journaling. Just get a journal, because there's psychological research that shows that simply journaling, and it doesn't matter whether you do it with pen and paper, notes page on your phone, on your laptop, or even just pretending to write in the air, has the same psychological release factor. But what happens is when you have all these emotions and don't know what to do with them, and you're feeling grief or anger or hurt, maybe you're coping from trauma and you don't know where to put all that. Imagine all of those emotions and thoughts like just rummaging around in your head and batting around the sides, and they're filling up all that space. How can you sleep with that? So your sleep's going to be affected, and how can you function with that? So imagine journaling is like pulling all of those thoughts out. And as you kind of pull them out and just make the intangible tangible, realizations often occur. And sometimes it's just a release factor of, I feel lighter. And maybe you have no realizations, but just the relief is enough that maybe you might get to sleep, or maybe you don't sleep as badly. So those things, I think, are the best way to start for anyone that's struggling. Because again, as you're pulling it out, what you realize is you have these realizations of, oh, that's where it came from. Oh, that's why I'm angry. Those little things that you otherwise wouldn't have.
Absolutely. I think that compound interest, like you're saying, of just little things, it starts to build over time. But sometimes you don't even realize. And that's when I think you do have to have some faith in nature taking its course, and just take a step. Like if you're an athlete, each day at practice, you don't see the gains each day, but over a month, over a year, you become a better athlete and a better human or whatever. It starts to change. Do you have any good advice for, maybe you're not the human in it, but you're someone like your dad, someone around the person that's in it that can be a good support system or know how to show up?
Yeah. So, again, identifying those patterns. So if you see someone and they've strayed from their normal behaviors, showing them you care. There is a real tendency to say, oh, they're just doing it for attention. And maybe you think, oh, this person's doing it for attention. Well, why not just reach out? If they're doing it for attention, especially if they're young, give them some attention. And it doesn't have to be the source of, oh, is everything okay all the time? And if you're not someone that is very good at having those kind of conversations, the attention can be, here's where I found resources that helped me. Here are some for you. So just being aware. And I think the education of a social media is a really good place to start. So if you're a parent and you see your child struggling or you see a friend struggling, one thing to know is social media has this way of making us feel like whatever we do, we're not good enough because we have this comparison. And most of the education you see from social media is empowerment and healing means becoming bulletproof. And that's impossible. This idea that, okay, to get to the point where you're going to be healed and happy means you don't care what people think about you. That is an impossible standard to reach because as human beings, we are built to care what people think about us. Our brain is wired in a way that physical pain and social pain are processed through the same regions. That's why when we feel a social rejection, it hurts. When we feel bad news, we feel that pit in our stomach. We are wired to care about those social relationships. So if you are seeing someone struggling, saying to them, it's okay. Like, it's okay to want to be accepted. It's okay to be affected by their opinions. And I hear a lot of people give advice of, how do I become bulletproof? And, here's how you stop caring what people think. And although that advice may be well-meaning, it's misguiding and it leads to more sense of shame. Because if you are trying not to care what people think and you still care what people think and you do these things and you're like, oh, I'm still not bulletproof, it can lead to more shame and more feelings of failure. But when you have that education of it's actually really normal to feel a bit empty, it's really normal to care what people think. Maybe not to extremes. So if you're feeling extremes, let's try and unpack that. Let's work on self-esteem. But simply providing that education of it's really okay to care what people think about you. You don't need to be empowered by that. I am who I am. Take me as I am. I don't care at all. That is not a healthy way to educate people. So I'd say that's the best advice of realistic expectations about healing. And as a parent and a loved one, when you see someone struggling, telling them this is part of the process.
Yeah.
Because again, when we think about empowerment and healing, what you often see on TV and media is, someone sat in a field and as they're meditating, there's flowers growing around them and they have these realizations of this is who I am.
Yeah.
And it's really wonderful and comforting and nice. And that healing process is really linear. So sometimes when our journey is, we feel good and then the next day we feel awful. We feel like a failure. This empowerment isn't feeling great like it looks on TV. With that education of it's not linear. It
Right.
doesn't feel good. It actually feels horrific. Healing is a horrible process because you have to look at yourself and look at all these negative behaviors, and maybe you've burnt bridges and maybe you've hurt people. And to heal, you have to unpack why. Why am I feeling shame? And those answers are usually sat behind really horrible experiences. Why am I getting into bad relationships? How do I stop myself? Maybe behind that is abuse you've suffered, abuse you've witnessed, and patterns you've learned. And those things are really difficult to unpack. So giving that education of you're never going to be bulletproof. You just won't. And it's okay to go up and down. That is fine. And you're human. Those emotions, they feel enduring, but they will pass. Just giving that advice, making people feel like it's normal. It is perfectly normal. There is nothing wrong with you.
There you go. And I think the through line there is telling our kids the truth. I think so much of it, we
Yeah.
want to be protectors, parents, coaches, older sisters, whatever you want to protect. And the reality is our young humans are coming, this phone is coming at them
Yeah.
very, very early. And as a marketing and branding professional, I'll sum up social media. It's all fake. It's all the highlight reel,
Yeah.
especially in health and wellness. I
Yeah.
started this podcast because I was managing influencers that were on health magazines and I knew there was disordered eating. And so I couldn't do it anymore. And like, so there's so much of it that's not real. Do you have any good advice, particularly for our young women, about self-esteem and pro tips there? I'm a massive advocate of life skills through sports. Athletics was my background, and I think that's provided so much of my own personal security, self-worth. But what are your suggestions around that for our young humans?
Yeah, I would agree. I would say one of the best ways to work on self-esteem is being active.
Mhm.
Just simply adding some level of activity every day has a really dramatic effect on self-esteem, because it doesn't matter if it should or not, but body image does and always will affect people's perception of you and your perception of yourself. It absolutely will. And like I
Mhm.
said, it shouldn't, but it does, because we've evolved to judge based on those things. So if you are feeling like how I am now, I'm not happy with, well, working on being healthy for you. But one thing I would really advise is the mindset over why is so important, because I see all over social media the revenge body. Get
Not the
fit,
Kardashians.
show
Yeah.
him show him what he's missing, or show her what she's missing. And if you do this and look better than the other person, then he'll want you back or she'll want you back. And that's a really toxic mindset to go into,
Yeah.
because if you're working out for someone else, what's going to happen is you're doing it for a comparison effect. So you're going to compile that effect. And then when you get to that shape, because you're doing it for a maladaptive reason, it's not going to be enough.
Right.
There's going to be another goal or another goal, because you're not really doing it for yourself. So looking inward and saying, okay, well, I actually deserve better than that. And I want to do this for me. How do I feel? And that's a really hard thing to do. It sounds simple, but we're constantly bombarded with, you should look like this. You should behave like this. And if you look on social media, people are shamed for being overweight. People are shamed for being skinny.
Yeah.
Women are shamed for being too muscly, for not being muscly enough. Men are shamed for being short, for being not muscly enough, for being this shape or that shape, or doing this. So if you're doing it for someone else, you're going to be bombarded with the shoulds. So
Yeah.
it doesn't matter where you get, because it's not really your goal, it's someone else's goal. So you're going to keep, I should. Look inwards and say, what do I actually want for
Yeah.
myself? And if you move away from the shoulds and say, you know what, I deserve to find what makes me happy. And that's what I'm going to work towards. And I'm not doing it for anyone else. I'm doing it for me. Working out for those reasons and eating for those reasons and just moving forward for those reasons is so, so much better for well-being. And then when you get to that point, you realize, I don't really care about the shoulds, because this is how I'm happy and how I'm comfortable.
Amen. And that message is for our young people, but really we ebb and flow. Even in adults, I've had breakdowns and breakthroughs,
Yeah.
in my 40s, and still trying to figure out. And you have to lean back to those skills that you mastered maybe in your 20s or still mastering. So it's constant ebbs
Yeah.
and flow. Such a wealth of knowledge. I have so many more questions for you, and we can go on, but I want to leave enough of a hanger so people go dive into this fabulous intel with your book. I do have to ask you our final question, and my most favorite one, the Dr. Abbie. What is success to you?
Success to me is coming home to a home full of love.
There you go.
That's it for me. Just coming home. And it doesn't have to be a person or a partner. It can be love for myself. And there's a quote that I live by, and it says, I'm building a home for myself where the doors don't slam. So when I come home and I feel peace, I know that I've made it.
Hey, I love that. I think the base of it, the through line, the intel like that I feel is just it really does start with that. Everything starts with that
It does.
self-love and that self-respect. And we're in a society where it's like find a partner, find a team, find a job, do
Yeah.
all these things. And that it all starts within and all those acts of
Yeah.
kindness every single day. The cliches somehow do come true. But also
They
dig
do.
into the science. So hit us with links, website, anywhere you want the people to find you.
Absolutely. So you can find everything on my website, which is Dr. Abbie Official, and it's Dr. DRABBIE Official, or abbieMaroño.com. I have a lot of educational material on my Instagram, which is Dr. Abbie Official, but that's doctor spelt out, Abbie Official, and then my LinkedIn, which is Dr. Abbie Maroño.
Checking all the boxes. Go check out her book, Work in Progress, The Road to Empowerment, The Journey Through Shame. She is an incredible, graceful disruptor. I know our audience and community will love what you have doing. I love that you question a better way and you do it so intentionally. And you're out on the academic side. So I always love when my doctors and PhDs and everything are the ones kind of in it, disrupting, big food,
Yeah.
big pharma and whatnot. So I wish you really well. And I welcome you back to TNT anytime. I know we each pieces of the puzzle that we talked about could have been its own whole podcast
Absolutely.
because there's so much to go there, but I love what you're doing. I can't wait to follow the journey. I do want to give a special thank you to our sponsors. Thank you, Lux Neuro, Neurofeedback and Counseling. Lux Neuro wants to meet you. If you're ready to transform your life, visit them at luxneuro.com. Colorado Clownfish Swim School, swim lessons and water safety training for all. We believe in life skills through sports. Waterproof your family today. So go swim, go move, as Dr. Abbie said. Thank you for joining us. I love, like I said, what you're doing. Please follow what she has going on. Her social media is absolutely one of the good ones. And I know there's some big stuff ahead. Is there anything big or events or anything you want to announce that's coming up?
Yeah, so I have a couple books coming out. I have one, as you said, Work in Progress, published. And then I have another one called The Upper Hand coming out in June 2025.
Hey, okay. Well, look for that. We will, of course, have this out in the new year in 2025. So we'll touch base. We build our community with our podcasters. So we'll stay in touch, but go check out Dr. Abbie. We are wherever you get your podcasts, and we will, of course, be on YouTube with this video. Have a great day. Cheers to a bright new year ahead.
Thank you for joining Turmeric and Tequila with your host, Kristen Olson. Tune in next time, and don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.